So we're here today for the First Steps takeover of Tune It Over, the first Tuesday every month, here with Amelia, Farouk, and we have our lovely guest, Ali Crewesmith, here with us today, our first guest. So we're really honoured. And today we're going to be chatting about what is your clinical educator thinking. So Ali does lots of great work at her trust, running the preceptorship, which is an amazing project. So she's going to talk a bit about that and, you know, just help us understand for students out there like myself, what is it that clinical educators are thinking, and give us a bit of advice and tips. So just be based on our experiences. Obviously, it's different for every placement and things like that, but hopefully we can share some words of wisdom that will really help you guys out there. So Ali, if you just want to give a bit of an introduction to yourself, tell us a bit about the preceptorship, and yeah, that'd be lovely.
Yeah, thanks so much, guys. This is really exciting to be involved in, and to spread the joy of being pre-registration and then, you know, developing into your post-registration role, which is a big passion of mine. And I'll tell you just a little bit about myself. So I qualified as a physio from Sheffield Hallam University in 2011. Really struggled to get a job initially. It was just that period of time where, you know, you kind of had to take anything. And I was just lucky enough to get a locum role at a local kind of, it was like an intermediate care hospital. And that then got me my rotational job at Derby. So back then it was sort of Derby teaching hospitals. And I did my rotations, ended up in MSK outpatients. I think I was always destined for that, unfortunately, because my mum's an MSK physio also, so I couldn't get away from it. But I've spent many years looking after students. I'm always the one that takes the extra student, and I've done all my clinical educator training. And then along the way, I applied and was successful in the role of gaining a new, it was a new role at the trust, and it was as the preceptorship lead for allied health professions, but also healthcare scientists, aiming to be like an interprofessional program that's provided at our trust. And when I first saw the job application, I thought, what is preceptorship? I've never heard of it, and most people haven't heard of it. And it's a really strange word, preceptorship. It doesn't particularly tell you what it's about, but what it is it's a support program. It's a concept, I suppose, of just supporting people who are transitioning from being a student to being a qualified professional. And I think everybody can think back to that time when they first qualified. And even if it was recently, it might have been a long time ago for some of the people listening. But when you first step into your uniform and you're signing your name for the first time and you're not having to be countersigned, it can be quite daunting. And I think there's lots of emotions and lots of pressure that people feel behind that. So preceptorship is about having that little bit of backup, you know, networking with other people, and learning a little bit about self-development, and not just about developing as a clinician. So it's for every profession, and that's what's quite nice about it. You know, it is for everybody across the trust. So I've been doing that role now for about 18 months. Started with a blank page. My first day was like, right, here you go, here's a computer. I was like, oh, right, okay. And I've done lots of bits of networking myself. I've spent many a time where I enter a room or knock on a door and I just, hello, I'm Ali. And it's really awkward, but that's what you have to do, you know, for people to sort of know what you do and know who you are. And I think I've got to the point now where people do know what I'm coming for when I walk into a room, which is nice. And I think, you know, it's constantly developing this role. But I think with regards to clinical education, you know, that is something that I really love. And I think I'm always learning, and I really want to impart that onto the people that I look after, whether they're students or newly qualified.
Absolutely, and I think that's the amazing thing. I mean, I myself am just a newly qualified. I don't know if I still count as newly qualified. It's been a year. It's been about a year now. I don't know when that title gets lifted off, but I'm still on the preceptorship, so well, it should be wrapping up. But I mean, if you're talking students now, I know that's a very important thing to them, getting the right amount of support, and coming on placements can be very nerve-wracking. And a lot of students, I remember when I was in my first one, my second one, and my third one, I would still be worried as to, you want to make the best impression, your first impressions. And I've had my fair share. I hold my hand up and I said, I've had my fair share of bad first impressions, right, on my part, and I've had my fair share of good ones. Now, I mean, from a clinical educator perspective, what is it? What are you looking for? How does a student make a good first impression? I know things like emails beforehand are always a good thing, but what are you thinking? Because we'd love to hear from an educator perspective how those things are actually beneficial to the student. Because every student always wants to get some high marks or make the best things or get the most out of the placement. So from your perspective, what are those little things? How much do they actually matter to you?
Yeah, good question. I think I've got to start with, I'm a little bit of a hypocrite here, because when I was a student, for one of my placements, I didn't actually contact the placement department, and I turned up on the first day and all the lights were off. I didn't know where I was going. And when I found my educator, she said, "Oh, I didn't know you were coming." And, I've learned a lot from that experience myself. And I think going forward into being an educator, I think really the answer to that is contact your placement area before you arrive. I think it's only polite to do that. And I think you can, like you say, Farouk, you can create such a great first impression by just that first contact. And it really does set the scene, I think. So, for example, in our department, one of my colleagues who's worked there for a long time, she said, "Ali, this is amazing. I've had the most amazing email from my student." And it was about 3 weeks before. But she said she's used such good punctuation. She sounds really nice. And, she signed it off with her name and then her title, student physiotherapist. And I think that's something that means so much to us. We're really, those kind of things to physios and any therapist, means a lot. It's those softer type things. So a nice email, I think, asking about the right things, not coming across too keen, but also coming across quite keen. I think it's really nice to have that contact beforehand, for me anyway. And I think, we used to have to ring them up, and you can do that. I think email's quite an easy way of doing it. But I think at least then you've got a little bit more of an idea of what you're expecting. And then we as educators definitely have more of an idea of what we're expecting from you. And I think every single educate different. So again, it gives them the opportunity to almost outline what they're expecting of you. And I think that's a good tip, email and say, what's expected of me? Because we do that a lot in therapy, don't we? And especially in outpatients, with our patients, we say, what are your expectations for physio? And if they don't marry up, and if you're not on the right track from the start, you're on for a bumpy ride. So yeah, you're absolutely right. First impression is so important, I think, sort of before you start. But then when you do start, turn up on time, wear a clean uniform and clean shoes. That's really important to me. Bring your badge, your name badge. Again, that is part of, a trust policy generally in most hospitals, but it does create a really good impression. Brush your hair. if you do brush your hair, that's a very old-fashioned thing. And I think for me, I say bring a notebook, because even if you're not really that interested, pretend that you're interested and write things down that I say. So if I say something that sounds relatively interesting, write it down, and then I'll think that you're interested, and then I'll think you're really good.
I love that. I hope that all students are interested, but yeah, I get what you're saying. I love a good notebook. I know for me, one of the things I get most nervous about is when people are observing me. I don't know what I should be doing. It makes me more nervous. Or like if I'm shadowing my clinical educator, I don't know how active I should be. So I don't know if you've got any tips along those sort of lines.
Yeah, I really like that sort of that question as well, because I find it really awkward too. And I think some educators really feel like they need to observe you doing something, and they need to be just a fly on the wall. That's how they have to assess you. And again, it comes back to, because I think it's having that conversation with your educator and between your educator and your student as to results here. And again, it is a little bit to do with how you learn as a student. So if you're aware of how you learn, I think you can then impart that knowledge onto your educator, and they should work with you to get the best out of you. Myself, my sort of approach often is, if the student's happy, I tend to kind of send them off on their own. I'll say, right, we'll have a discussion before. What are you thinking? What are you going to do with this patient? And they'll do a little bit of an outline. If I'm happy with that, and they're going to be safe to go and have a conversation, I definitely just send them off on their own, because I think you learn the best way by just doing it. And yeah, you might make a few mistakes. You might say something in the wrong way, but that's the way that you're going to learn.
Oh, I think Ali's broken up a bit.
Yeah. Let's see. Let's give it a few seconds. Let's see if her internet reconnects.
I feel like she was just about to make a really good point as well.
Yeah. Very, very poor timing. Yeah. Oh no, I think she actually is frozen.
Okay, so hopefully Ali will rejoin us. I'll just send her a quick email, but I don't know, Farouk, how do you find it when you're observing people? Oh,
I think, is she back?
Yeah, she's back.
I'm back.
Okay.
Thank you for coming back.
Oh, pleasure, sorry. This is what happens now. Everything's online.
Don't worry about it. We felt like you were making like a really good point about, your strategies for helping students to learn and things like that.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. So I was going to say my strategy is, I just send them in. I think the patient needs to really trust the student as well. And I think sometimes if you're there and your badge says senior physiotherapist, and then the student has student physiotherapist, the patient keeps looking at you as the physio, the qualified physio. And that makes it awkward as well. So if you send the student in, let them make a mistake, as long as they're not going to push the patient over and the patient's going to fall on the floor. Let them have a conversation, let them make some mistakes if they need to. But I think that's the way that they will learn best. And then I think, I trust my student to then come out and speak to me, depending on how they feel, whether they can recognize their limitations. They come back at me, and we discuss sort of what they want to do next. And I think if it goes on to like an objective assessment and they feel like they need a little bit of guidance, I'll say, do you want to do it together? And quite often they'll say, yes, please. So we go in together and we're a little team. And I think in response to your question, talking about, how you work together, how you can shadow your educator, I think, again, it's being a little bit of a unit. When I go into my patient with a student, I say, oh, we've just been discussing this and we've decided this. And, Joe Bloggs has said to me, this is my student, Joe's just said to me that, he feels that you should probably do a little bit more of this. And you're empowering the student a little bit more with that. And I think that's really nice, because a massive thing that I really feel that is my main objective with having a student with me is actually trying to improve their confidence as much as possible. but to an appropriate level. So not being overconfident, but being confident in what they know, being confident also in what they don't know, because that's something, again, where in your career you're going to always have to be very, very conscious of what you do know and then what you don't know. And that's the best way to be. That's the way you're always going to learn. So it encourages that, definitely.
Absolutely. I think I missed out some parts of it. I'll be honest. I think my connection went away, but at least I was able to catch the end of it. It was your connection and mine. Another thing that I think a lot of students are very curious about is assessments. You know, everyone has to go through assessments, and assessments. As a student, I knew that I was being assessed from day one, which and every educator has a bit different style. But how do you recommend students go about with the assessment phase? Because that can be a very daunting process. When you're being watched, as Amelia said, you're being shadowed, you're being assessed, and you're going to have further assessments even more formally. You're being assessed on multiple different facets, be it clinical skills, non-clinical skills, how do you work with the team. You've been assessed on multiple different streams, and sometimes to students that can give you some level of anxiety or panic, where you're like, oh, you're going to be doing things that you're not comfortable doing. You're just worried that you make a mistake and it crumbles down. What advice could you give to students who going through that assessment process and that they know you're being assessed? What would you say to them?
Yeah, well, it's really interesting because I've had such a variety of students, some that come and don't even know that there's an assessment at the end of a placement, which is very interesting. And then we have students at the other end of the spectrum who are so fixed on getting a high mark that, like you say, they cause themselves anxiety, and it affects their performance. Because part of being a physiotherapist and part of being a healthcare professional is actually having, a little bit of a personality, having, like I say, being aware of your limitations, and being, part of the team. And I think if you're too sort of caught up on marks and marking criteria, that can be a bit detrimental. What I would advise is, what's really nice for me as a clinical educator is when people arrive and they know what the marking criteria says, they know about the assessment paperwork, and the student actually is the one that can teach you about the assessment paperwork. Because as educators, we do have students from different universities, and at the moment the assessment paperwork is different for each university, so it may be one that we've never seen before. So I think if you come very prepared, if you're proactive about it, also to help you use that assessment criteria to guide your objectives. So I like to update their objectives weekly, probably, because you say, right, what are you going to achieve this week? How are you going to help me as an educator to tick off these boxes and help to mark you? Because I want to help them. I'm not there to catch them out. So if they say to me, oh, Ali, I haven't really assessed a little toe yet this week, can I please do a physical assessment of a little toe? And I'll be like, yeah, brilliant, let's do that. And I will help to guide them through that, and then I can help to mark them. So yeah, I think there's always going to be a bit of anxiety around that, but I think if you can be the one that leads it, and like I say, is proactive, you're prepared, again, that gives just such a good impression of you as a professional, not just a student. So that would be my advice, really.
Proactivity is very key. Proactivity, and let as a student, you should be actively engaging and trying to see what you can do to get those marks and see what you're doing and making sure everything is outlined clearly from the start to the finish to the middle, and reassessing constantly just to make sure you're keeping on top of that. So I think that's very, very good advice.
Absolutely, actually. Yeah. And I think especially at the moment, because the thing that we don't speak about over the last year has changed clinical placements a little bit.
Yeah.
And, you know, we haven't had as many face-to-face patients in outpatients anyway. And I think we've still had students coming through the doors, but from the start, I say, you know, you've got to be in charge of what you want to get out of this placement. So I want you to almost tell me what you want to do. So my student at the moment said, oh, I really want to spend some time in pediatrics. So I said, yeah, I can help facilitate that. Brilliant. And she's spending a few days in pediatrics. On the other hand, there might be a few hours where, you know, I don't really have any patients, but I've got some admin to do. And I'll say, you know, are you okay for an hour or so? And she says, yeah, I'm fine. I've got some stuff to do. I've got some reflections to do. Or she'll go and find another professional that has a patient. And I think that's really, really helpful to me. It makes it much easier to me as an educator. And I think that's reflective of that student as well, because they're managing themselves. You don't want to be a burden as a student. I think nobody wants to be a burden, but I think if you can be proactive, that's just really good.
Yeah, I know I found that difficult during COVID because I know there's like lots of pressures on the staff, and I know I'm a student and I want to learn as much as possible, but equally, you know, I don't want to put too much stress on the staff because I'm aware they're stressed already with COVID. So I have found it like more difficult negotiating things, and I found that I have had to communicate even better because of the way things have been. It just means like having more regular catch-ups, or sometimes there'll be lots of staff changes and things like that. So there has been a lot of navigation and communication skills and things like that I've had to be really aware of.
Definitely. Yeah.
Before I pass it back to Amelia, was you know, when we come back to assessment, when we get the feedback, and you know, sometimes feedback isn't always what you want to hear. A lot of times you might get some feedback you think that is negative. So how do you advise the students deal with that constructive feedback? Because I know most of the times, you know, I'd say 99% of the time when the educator gives feedback, it's for the student's best interest. But sometimes when you're hearing that feedback, you're not going to be as receptive, or it's not what you wanted to hear, and it might demoralize you a bit. How does one deal with that constructive feedback?
I know. I don't think in my career I've not really had any experience myself of doing an assessment with a student where anything's come as a surprise to them. And I do feel a little bit like that is down to the educator, where I think feedback is really important to do along the way. But equally, you know, I do lead some giving feedback training for colleagues. And, you know, a really good tip for feedback is having a conversation, again, being proactive, having a conversation beforehand to your student and saying, how do you want to receive feedback? Because one of them might say, oh, do you mind just like telling me at the end of the day? Or we could have a discussion, you know, at the end of the week about feedback. And some of them, and quite often they'll say, oh, could you just give me feedback along the way, you know, constructive criticism. So it's going to help me improve as I go along. And I think that works. And I think that's the key really, is not having those surprises, because students generally, when they're not doing quite as well at something, they're generally very aware of it. Over aware of it, and I think that is really important to have those discussions, you know, short little snippets along the way. So when you get to the assessment and perhaps you've got your tutor in front of you and you're having a conversation, it's not the first time that they've heard it, so it's always a difficult conversation. But I think a tip for a student, if it is something that you aren't expecting and you don't potentially agree with, you know, I think ask for an example, because at times you can have a feeling that maybe the student didn't do so well at this, and it might be that you politely ask, could you give me an example of that? Or you might say, I could give you an example actually of when I did do a little toe assessment on a patient, and I actually did it with with somebody else. I did it with your colleague. So, this is what I did and blah, blah, blah. So I think examples are really good. And I think stand up for yourself a little bit. Don't be rude, but just stand up for yourself and say and challenge it. And could you give examples? And, what can I do better in the future to improve? And then it might be this halfway where you say, for the rest of my placement, do you think that you could give me the feedback along the way? Because I'd really appreciate that. And yes, it's maybe a bit too late, but does that help? Does that
better late than never?
Better late than never.
They're able to take on something for the next placement. So that's how I look at it.
That's it.
Even if I wasn't able to, I had a placement. I'll pass back to Julia now for a second, but I had one of the worst placements I've ever had. Multiple reasons, myself included. I didn't enjoy team, etc. But then I thought to myself, I have to rebound from this and I have to take something. When the next one I have was the highest placement I never scored in. So, sometimes you take what you can from the negative one and then you take it on to the next one. You can't just keep looking back forever, because I was just waiting.
Definitely. And it might be like you say, there's lots of factors, aren't there, on a placement that make you get really good marks or not so good marks. There were some placements for me that they didn't really float my boat. I could tell, but I was trying to play the game a little bit, get the marks that I could to move forward to the next one. And you might really excel with your next educator. And I think that's something that we forget. You may not have a very good relationship with your educator, and it's just a case of getting through it really and doing your very best for those.
Those are some great tips, and I think sometimes you can forget that when you're sort of in the midst of it and there's all these things going on. But one thing that I think is quite useful to think about is like what's going to happen next, because when I'm in a placement I'm like, oh well, maybe this is a place I'd like to work in, or if I've had a really good placement I'm like, I would love to work with this team, this trust, like there's elements of it that I could see myself working in the future. So have you got any tips for students who've had a really good placement and think, oh yeah, I want to work here? Any tips that they could go about getting closer to that?
Yeah. Well, I think most jobs now are put out externally on NHS Jobs. So it's a case of, keeping looking on NHS Jobs or some of the online platforms there. And I think on that you can set up alerts so that you get emailed every week or every so often telling you what jobs are coming out. So that's the first thing I think that you really should do. But I think stay in touch with your educator. For me, I always offer that. I say, email me if you've got any questions, or if you want me to support you or do your reference, do let me know, because I have done references for students before when they're applying for jobs. And that's quite a nice connection to have. I think it's difficult because jobs now aren't put out on lamppost, on paper, that it's all online. But I think having your application ready to go is also a really, really good thing. And it might be that your educator can give you a few tips for that. But yeah, having your job application, the skeleton of it is really good, because if a job does come up and they've got quite a tight closing date, then you can just send in an application. And then, hopefully you'll get an interview. Yeah,
I quite like doing that sort of like structure and skeleton, but then I always end up revising it loads and loads of times. So I think that is a good thing to bear in mind. I know we're coming to the end of the show now. We've got about a minute left. So yeah, this has been the First Steps takeover of Chewing It Over. You can follow us at PM First Steps, and we'll link Ali's Twitter handle as well, in case you want to follow her and see her tweets about preceptorships and the great work that she's doing. I know that me and Farouk are really honoured to have you here, and just like your enthusiasm for student learning is really contagious. So that's really nice. And I know when I chatted to you before, one of the things about your approaches that really stood out to me was your approach that you wanted students to just learn to be the best version of themselves, and it's finding ways of how they can be, their best individual physio, which I thought was just really nice.
Definitely.
Thanks a lot, Ali, for coming on. I don't know if you guys can see my face. I doubt it. Am I still frozen?
Yeah, you're still frozen. We've been trying so many ways to get you unfrozen,
but I've taken a little bit of a picture. But thanks a lot for coming on at the very least. At least this.
Thanks so much. I've really enjoyed it, guys. Thank you.
Okay, gonna cue the outro now.
Take care.